Well, last year for me on a physical basis was a very challenging year. About this time a year ago, I had returned from the Philippines, and as always seemed to happen after being in the Philippines, my stomach was not quite on. It was a little bit off, and I figured that's what was going on again. But as time went on over the next several weeks and even into several months, things did not resolve themselves, and I ended up actually having to go to the emergency room in the middle of May. And at that point discovered that there were several things going on that made my physical life a real challenge. One, I had a kidney stone. I had a rapid heartbeat that would not settle down. And I had ulcerative colitis. One of the things that really got to me, frankly, during that time would be more on a spiritual level. And of course, all that time, people were praying for me. I was praying for myself. People came to visit and pray. I was aware that Jesus was present with me during those days, but it felt like he was always staying just slightly behind my peripheral vision. That if I turned my head, he'd move. He wouldn't come out front and center. And I really needed more of Jesus than I was experiencing at that point. And it bothered me a lot that he did not come and make himself more physically present to pick me up and hold me and care for me in the way that I really felt that I needed and wanted. I began to question my own heart and soul. Is there something wrong with me and my faith that was keeping Jesus distant that way? I began to think about just how is Jesus sufficient in our lives? And I was prompted to think about Jesus as he was forced to carry his own cross to Calvary and realized that he did not have enough strength on his own to carry it the full distance. And that bothered me. I thought, what is this? Why doesn't Jesus have enough strength to do this whole thing? And I've contemplated that for quite some time, and I still don't have a lot of real good answers, but it bothered me that Jesus was not where I needed him to be. But I also came to the conclusion as I looked at that, a couple of things. Number one, Jesus' presence in my life at that point was sufficient, but it was not fully satisfying. Went home for a little while, hoping that the medication I'd been taking was going to resolve the ulcerative colitis, but it did not. I had to go back into the hospital again. Early, I was admitted one evening. Early the next morning, the surgeon arrived about 6:30 in the morning, and I figured, well, this must be something important. And it was. He said, I've been talking with your care team. We've decided we need to remove your colon today. Have an appointment for you. The operating room is available at 1. And really did not have any time to process what was going on with this. Just, went through with the surgery. Over the course of the coming weeks, I began to hopefully get a little stronger. At times I didn't feel like it. There were complications that came up that put me back in the hospital several times. One of the times when I was in the hospital for complications, the PICC line they'd put in my arm here to help just work with the medication began to malfunction just a little bit, and they wondered, is there a blood clot forming in my arm? And so they sent me for an ultrasound in which they do the whole thing, up your arm, into your shoulder, neck area. The result of that was twofold. One, there was no blood clot, but second of all, they discovered some what they called suspicious nodes in my thyroid. The end result of that investigation was that I now was discovered to have cancer of the thyroid. A few weeks later, Carol and I went and sat down with Dr. Fox, the surgeon who was going to do the thyroidectomy. The first thing she said to me was, I suppose people have told you that thyroid cancer is a good kind of cancer to have. And I said, yeah, I've heard that. And she said, well, let me tell you, no cancer is good to have. And I said, I've kind of figured that. The next thing she said kind of shocked me too. She said, because of your advanced age, these are the concerns we have. And I'm thinking, age 56, I didn't think that was so advanced in age. As I sat there listening to Dr. Fox in that appointment, there were two strong feelings I had. The first was, I just wanted to cry. One thing after the other was not going well. The other thing that was in my heart, and I kept it there for a couple hours because I needed to process it before I shared it with Carol, my wife, or anyone else, was this. I wonder if this is what will take my life. On Friday of that week, I went back to Regions Hospital for an outpatient procedure. They were going to hopefully remove a drain that had been put into my stomach because I had developed an abscess. That was one of the complications that came along. And I was just really strongly praying and hoping that it would be able to be removed. And as we went through all of the process of determining, the doctor said, "Yep, we can take that out," and boom, out they take it. And it was great to have that out. To have that prayer answered, it seemed like finally something good was happening. And I just literally had tears of joy as I lay there in the hospital briefly as they took that thing out. And went home and was tired, so I just kind of stretched out on the sofa for a while and was just contemplating things and giving thanks to God for this good thing that had happened on this day, when I began to sense God was speaking to me. And basically what I heard was this, "David, I've given you a much greater blessing." And I'm thinking, well, what is that? And God said, "Well, what have you been praying about for yourself for quite some time?" And I realized I'd prayed for years, literally, that God would take the callousness out of my heart. And at that point, God said to me, "David, I have made your heart tender." And I knew, I could sense it at that point. I'd seen it along the way, but I'd never been conscious of it until that moment when God put that on my heart and mind. That made this one of the best weeks of my life, frankly. Well, a couple of more weeks go by, and I'm getting ready. About a week hence, I'm going to have my thyroid removed, and some friends of mine came to spend some time with me, to pray with me, ultimately anoint me with oil, pray for healing. But before we did any of that, we just talked a little bit, and then my friend David said, "Let's just pray first right now and just ask for God's presence." And he prayed a very simple prayer that way. And we sat silently for a while. And then David said, how are you feeling God's presence here? And I said, "David, here is what it feels like to me. I have this image that Jesus has walked in the door and sat down in the chair next to me. And he allowed me to reach over and grasp his left arm in his hand. And there was joy and peace and encouragement and fullness and love, all good, positive things. We're just really feeling that very strongly. And I remember kind of feeling his hand. It was like I was feeling his hand and feel that scar. That's a really beautiful thing to feel, the scar of Jesus. There's one side that says, I know I'm one of the billions of people on this earth who really were the cause of the nail going through that hand, but I am one of those who is blessed to receive the benefit of Jesus' obedience to his Father in that. And then as we sat there, holding his arm in his hand, I began to be prompted to recall the words of a Charles Wesley hymn. Arise, my soul, arise, shake off thy guilty fears. The bleeding sacrifice on my behalf appears. Before the throne my surety stands. My name is written on his hands. And at that point it was as if Jesus said, look at my hand, at my right hand, and I looked and there was my name written on his hand. After a short while, Jesus said, I'm glad to be able to spend this time with you, but I need to go on now. But my spirit will remain with you. And he got up and left. There was such a strong sense of goodness that was there, and an absolute assurance that there is nothing that I need to be afraid of, because my name is written on his hands. And from that date forward, there is nothing that has caused me to fear. There have been other things I've encountered that should have made me, uptight, afraid. That's not the case. To have spent that time, now I don't know if Jesus literally was sitting there next to me, but there was a spiritual presence of God with me, and this is how I understand it in this way. I can say this, to have experienced Jesus to that extent, there is nothing I want more. To have experienced Jesus to that extent after having gone through significant physical challenges, have moved from the point of, hey, I know Jesus, you're around, but I need more of you, but he wasn't there as much as I needed, to that point where I've sat with him. There's nothing more that I need. To know Jesus in that way is something I want everyone to know Jesus in that way. Because if you meet Jesus to that extent, there is no way that you will turn your back on him. There is no way that you will feel dissatisfied. And I'm thankful to have been able to experience that. There's a part of me, frankly, though, that feels embarrassed, a bit ashamed. How come it took 56 years for me to get to that point of my Christian life and faith? But I also realize that it is a gift from God, and he chooses to give that when he wishes. And I'm thankful to know Jesus to that extent. As I look back at all that went on in my life in 2015, if I had to do it over again, I would do it all over again. Simply because of the goodness of meeting Jesus to that extent.